Hello, everyone. I'll try to keep it a little bit lively after lunch. So Rick invited me. We're here learning about all the wonderful uses of AI and the new innovations and improvements and techniques. Yes, in the panel on life sciences just now. I'm here to talk about the problems. Sorry to be the wet blanket. There are three problems that I want to talk about. Clicker. Oh, down button. Three problems: copyright, a little bit then on privacy and liability, which Rick also mentioned just now. So in order to do that, I want to just revisit, you guys know so much better than me, but I want to revisit a little bit some aspects of how the large language models in particular are created, or generative AI models more generally, looking at the training data, looking at the parameters, and looking at the modular character of how they work. Then look at some of the problems. Go through them one by one. So training the large language models, I want to start with BERT. So transformers have been around for a while, but this bidirectional transformer achieved very important and interesting results. And it was trained on about 10 billion tokens. That's a lot of text, right? That's, 7 billion words or so. And the sources were two things: Wikipedia in English, I believe only English Wikipedia, and something called the book corpus, which was a whole bunch of novels downloaded from a website, something like, like a Webtoons kind of site of amateur novels. About 11,000. It turned out there were a lot of repeats. And it was the reason that the researchers wanted to use Books Corpus, that had been around for a while, was because it had a long continuous text, so that they could see how well their model could handle context, long context of text. Now, this wasn't without some controversy. This Books Corpus had been used already from 2015, 2016. And even in 2016, the authors of these novels said, oh, hey, we didn't actually give you permission to use your text for that, my text for that purpose. Yes, you can download the book free to read it, but I said on my copyright page, you can download it free for your reading pleasure, not for any other purpose. So here Google is using it for another purpose. And Google said, well, it doesn't harm the authors, doesn't hurt them, because we're just using it to improve our email autocomplete. And it's a very different purpose, so it's okay. So the issue has been alive actually since 2016. So we fast forward a few more years, and we see now with GPT-3 a much larger training set, right? If that's BERT, that's the 10 billion, now we're scaling up to approximately 300 billion tokens being used on a 175 billion parameters model. Books are still quite important part of that. There are two data sets, books 1 and 2, that were about 48 billion tokens out of the 300 billion total. And even the common crawl, this web scrape, right? So everyone says the models are trained by reading the internet. But that kind of characterization makes you think it's all reading user-generated content, and it's all reading Reddit and Twitter and so on. When in fact, if you look at how the Common Crawl data set was about a trillion tokens, but they only used 180 billion tokens to train GPT-3. And the way that that was filtered was, well, let's see, I think I have a slide on that. Yeah, the way that was filtered was by training another model to recognize high-quality content. So what was the training data for that? So high-quality content was content from books, and then low-quality content was the content from the web crawl. So that was the training set, and then you compared the crawl to those examples. So you run everything through the classification model: good, bad, good, bad, good, bad. So yeah. So as a publisher, I get a little irritated when I hear, oh, it's trained by reading the internet. In fact, it's trained by reading lots of books. But okay, this was ChatGPT. This is GPT-3. This is 2020. This is a long time ago. Now we're in 2023. Things have changed, right? Now we're talking about, instead of just 300 billion tokens, with books, being there, now we're talking about, what, 1.4 trillion, 2 trillion tokens for Llama 2. Surely publisher content can't be part of that, It's got to be just the wilds of the internet. Well, no, in fact, if you look at the Chinchilla paper was quite seminal, right? Where Google DeepMind in London folks said, actually, the returns to scale are not coming from increasing parameters. The returns to scale come from having more data. So this kind of changed the paradigm, right? But so they trained Chinchilla with only 70 billion parameters, much smaller, but on 1.4 trillion tokens. And what were the sources of that text? Well, it turns out that 420 billion tokens were from books, from 4 million books. Now, the British Library contains 14 million books. So where did Google get 4 million books to train the model from? Well, it must be Google Books, right? Which is, when we send our books to Google Books, we didn't know that they were going to use it for this. So, and then also news, 180 billion tokens are from news stories, 1.1 billion news stories. And then the rest comes from web sources, including, importantly, GitHub, right? So GitHub provided about 56 billion tokens of computer code. And then, of course, other people have fine-tuned off of that. So I think the point is that, well, let's just stick with this for a second. The point is that the copyright situation around the copying of all of this material is by no means clear. But what I want you to know first is that, yes, it's trained on the internet, these data sources, but where they come from originally, a lot of it is publisher content and researcher content. Now, what about parameters? Okay, so what are these models? I think this is a question that I'm interested in because it has to do with how they're regulated. Okay, you will all have your different understanding of what the parameters are. But one interesting thing is that the parameters are, you can think of them as a kind of representation of the data they were trained on, right? They're the weights that are adjusted as you feed more text in, as the model learns to predict the missing words. And the weights are all adjusted. And at the end of the day, what is that? So one idea is to say it's an understanding of the world, right? So Ilya Sutskever, chief scientist of OpenAI, will say, because they've learned language, they understand the world. But other people will say, no, it's just a statistical model of language use and of the relationship of words to other words in different contexts. And the difference to this is kind of interesting. So can you say that the parameters, the weights in the model are a kind of software? Or can you say actually that they're a kind of data, that they are a different representation, a translation, if you will, of the training data into a much more compressed, absolutely much more compressed, but abstract representation of the training data? So are the parameters, is it software? Do you have now a software that you can run and reprogram? Or do you have a big set of data that you use to, a set of variables that you use for different purposes? I think there's only one possible answer. It's both, right? It's something in between. I mean, think about it. Can you program a large language model? Once you have it, can you program it? No, right? You can train it more and you can prompt it, but you can't program it in the sense of a classical cause and effect logic-based software. So the third point then, the modular nature of how the models work. I think we really have to think about them as a system. It starts with the data and it goes all the way to the end user. Now, data is created by humans. It's not all copyrighted, but it's created by humans, right? There's weather, but it's not data until somebody decides to record it, right? So it begins with humans, then we choose the data that we train our models on, then we train our foundation model. We get our pre-trained large language model. Now, most of the activity, as far as I can see in the last few years, has, with large language models especially, has been in the adaptation and the fine-tuning. So reinforcement learning with human feedback, various kinds of filtering, various kinds of model, what Stanford calls model patching, modular plugging in the models to each other, like creating a classification model to say this is good, this is bad, and so on. So that's where a lot of the activity is. Then at some point, the companies decide to make it available to the public. Open source in the case of Llama, or proprietary through OpenAI, and so on. A lot of that is through the APIs, so fascinating to have this power on tap for your purposes. And then many businesses now are built on APIs. When Sam Altman was in Singapore the other day, so many of the people speaking at the session and asking questions said, I have started a marketing business based on the OpenAI API. And then you have the end user. So I think it's very important that we always think of this. We can't just think Google, we can't just think OpenAI. We have to think about the whole ecosystem when we think about how these models will be received and used. Okay, let me look at the problems. Copyright. So the first argument of Google that we heard already back in 2016, but we've heard from all of the AI companies, is its fair use. I don't know, do you guys want to get deep into copyright law? The short answer is very uncertain, because the American system of fair use is something that a judge decides based on current examples. So it's very hard to know in advance. It's a good system because it's flexible. You have a new technology. We have these principles to decide whether it's legal or not legal. But it takes a long time, and it takes a court, and there are all kinds of details that can determine what the thing is. So personally, I think it's, well, even the number one lawyer for stable diffusion now in one of the legal cases in the US, Mark Lemley, a Stanford professor, he says, there's no way the models can be fair use because they reproduce their training data too easily. So how can something which can copy be fair use, right? Because the output is copying exactly the input, at least some of the time. So that's his view. I won't argue with the Stanford professor. Then in Europe, and maybe in Singapore, we say, our models are trained under exceptions. So we have these exceptions which allow us to use content that we have access to. And that's true, but even in the European law and in the Japanese law, there are these guardrails, there are these conditions upon this. And one of the most interesting ones is the commercial, non-commercial distinction. So Stable Diffusion says, it was a German researcher who built the Leon data set, which we trained the model on, which is now, as Stable Diffusion. So non-commercial, and we just happen to be commercializing it, right? That's how research is supposed to work, non-commercial research, commercialization. But when you look at the details, you see that all the computing power of the non-commercial research unit was funded by Stable Diffusion. And when you look at the staff of Stable Diffusion, the CTO is also the head of the research group. So these boundaries are a bit fuzzy. So what is the answer? And then, of course, also, one of the things which we publishers have noticed is that even under the European and the Singaporean law, where you have a lot of freedom to copy to train your models, you still must have legal access to what you train. And one of the big data sets, the pile, I'm sure some of you have played around with that data set, it has a lot of stuff that is just pirated content. So it has about almost 200,000 novels, which are illegally copied in the first place. So it's not certain that these models are legal from a copyright perspective. Wow, I mean, to me, that's like, I want to use these models, don't get me wrong, right? I want to use them. I love to use these models. I want to do it in a way that is legal and respects the interests of everyone involved. One of the first things I did was ask when ChatGPT came out, was I asked it to read me some Harry Potter. And so it read me the first paragraph very easily, and it told me helpfully who wrote Harry Potter and when it was published, the first novel. Amazing, right? Fantastic. Then I said, read me the second two paragraphs. It said, I am a large language, you've been there, right? I am a large language model. I cannot just read books or read the internet. Like, yeah, but you can, right? So next question, okay, read me the first paragraph and the next two sentences. And they can do that. So what's happening here is that, OpenAI has put a patch on it. It's put a filter. It's comparing the outputs against the training data and saying if they're too close, if they're too similar, don't repeat it. Or I don't know what heuristic they may be using other heuristics to do that. I don't know. So the big argument on, well, I'll skip this because this is a little bit technical on fair use again. What is the purpose? But the short way to look at it is this, I think. If I'm a photographer and my photos are used to train a self-driving car, to say, oh, that's a stop sign, and that's another car. As a photographer, that doesn't hurt me, right? I mean, I'm helping train a model which will save lives. But the problem is now that the models are being used for the same purpose that I had in mind when I took the photograph. They're being used to create art. They're being used to create expression. So many AI companies are saying, oh, you don't need a writer anymore. You can just use ChatGPT. So it's being used to harm the market of the writers. At the Sam Altman talk in Singapore, I met a friend of mine who manages a big government IT company. She said, oh yeah, I just sacked 2 marketing people because we don't need them anymore, because we have the engines. So the models are starting to encroach on the area of the people whose works were copied. Just ask Greg Rutowski. So he's an artist who creates this kind of work, and when people started playing with Stable Diffusion and WALL-E, they wanted to create work like this, because who wouldn't, right? So drama. So it became the most used prompt in the style of Greg Rutowski. And so many people made so many images in the style of Greg Rutowski that if you search for Greg Rutowski, you see all the AI-created images and you don't see his. So he said, that's not right, So this is the copyright problem. It's not so much that it is illegal to train the models, but it's that the models are being used for purposes, the same purposes of which the training data was created. So there's a kind of confusion there. Does that make sense? Do you see that point of view? So how are we going to resolve that? Who knows, right? It's being debated, it's being discussed. There are about 10 court cases in the US where this is all being argued right now. Next question, privacy. So given that huge amount of training data and the fact that much of it is scraped from the internet, we know that there's personally identifiable information in the models. And many people have demonstrated that it's very easy to get personal identifiable information from the large language models. So, but if you do get that, you actually don't know for sure that it was in the training data, because maybe the model just hallucinated it, right? If it wasn't there, it could easily, it knows what an email address looks like, so it could give an email address. It knows what citations look like, so it very easily gives fake citations all the time, right? So we don't even really know, even if we see it out of the model, we don't know if it's in the training data or not. Now, the GDPR and other privacy laws, and by the way, the Chinese laws are even tougher than the European and the American laws. They all require that if there's personal data on a website or anywhere, that you have the right to get it back, to take it out. How are you going to do that for a large language model? How are you going to pull that out of the training? You're going to tell it, okay, you just retrain without these 5 people in it? No, I mean, it costs what, $10 million to train a model. So this is a bit of a problem. How are you going to do it at scale? You can filter, or maybe at the outputs. So you can say, okay, no emails, no. And OpenAI is pretty good. ChatGPT will say, oh, I cannot share personal information. So, but that's filtered on the output. And you guys are super clever. You know how to prompt engineer to get around these, how to jailbreak the models, right? So this is the OpenAI statement, and I believe them for the first, I believe this completely, 100%. But let me just tell you the last part. So we fine-tune our models to reject requests for personal information. We've all seen that happen. That's great. And we respond to requests from individuals to delete their personal information from our systems. I love this answer. We respond to requests, meaning, oh, thank you for your request. And then what? I mean, they don't say we delete personal information from our systems upon request. So, yeah, because they can't. I mean, they can't. It's not, the architecture of the system just doesn't work this way. And then liability. Who is responsible for the crazy things the models say? What happens if ChatGPT says, so-and-so is a sexual harasser, has been accused of sexual harassment at his university? Well, you can ask the professor who this happened to. And it wasn't, strangely enough, it wasn't just one model, it was two. Both Bard and ChatGPT also gave the same answer. God, why, I don't know. So, the reporters all called up Google and said, what are you going to do about this? And Google said, we are making steps to ensure that our results are safe. They don't know why it happened. They can't do anything about it. The models, there's no relationship between a large language model's output and truth. And this is the connection with education, right? The large language models are plausible, but they don't speak, there's just no relationship between truth and what they say. The technical term for this is bullshitters, right? It's not that you're lying, it's that you're just talking. We've all had colleagues like that, right? Who are very good at talking, but whether it's true or not is another question. So these are the three problems. Who is going to be responsible for what the models say? This is another way of looking at the complex system. I reduced it to 4, right? But we have the pre-trainer, the model publisher, the B2B customer, and the end user. The AI Act in Europe is trying to say, look, the person who trained the model, who created the foundation model, the pre-trained model, must be responsible for the output. But OpenAI and Google are pushing back very hard with the help of the US government. And they're saying, no, only the company who's offering the product, the interface, who's doing whatever special pre-prompting or fine-tuning, only they should be responsible for liable if something goes wrong. And so that fight is going on now in Europe. I don't know what the answer is. Again, China is actually much more extreme, right? China says, you who create the model are responsible for everything, including recording all the prompts that you've received from people. So China has a much stricter idea about that the companies must take responsibility for this, which is quite interesting. So we have 3 different kinds of regulation approaches to this, and whether we'll have 3 different worlds of AI because we have 3 different kinds of regulation remains to be seen. So what should our stance be as educators? Here I'm speaking for publishers and educators. I think we just have to say, hey, this is bigger than just Google or AI or Facebook. This is a big question that we all have to decide together. So don't just say, oh, it's coming, it's a new technology, what can we do? Yes, they're super rich, these companies. They made a lot of money already from these technologies. I'm not sure they're making money now. I mean, you look at the inference costs of ChatGPT and the revenue streams, there may be a mismatch there. But, so we just have to say, no, we have to decide this as a society. There are many other issues I didn't talk about. The bias thing could keep us here all day. But of course, as educators and as publishers, we have to learn about these systems. We have to know how they work. We have to try them. Our students are going to use them if we don't. So of course we have to know. I spent the morning editing text, and let me tell you, GPT-4 is very good assistant to me to edit text. I love it. I used it all morning. So yeah, I guess that's my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Just hold on a second. Anyone any question for Peter? If no question, I have one question. No, just now, actually, before I look at your slide, I was thinking, I mean, we all know that recently OpenAI have this GTP bot. It's going to crawl the whole internet.
Yeah.
So we know that actually they are all pirated books. As I can tell everyone, any books you want, you can find a copy on the internet, no matter how publisher, how library try to safeguard it. So, with a very smart way of doing prompt engineering, do you think, I don't think anyone have ever done it, you just try, can reproduce a book?
Yeah, I mean, the Mark Lemley paper that I referred to, where he's written it together with some computer scientists, and they're arguing for a new way of training the models. And they worked much harder to reproduce the training data, and they got whole chapters of Harry Potter. Harry Potter's an easy example because there's so many pirate copies, so there are many copies probably in the training data. Of course, they try to dedupe, but it's not perfect. Even in images, even stable diffusion, you can get it reproduces its training data less than 1% of the time, less than 0.1% of the time, but we're talking pixel perfect. I mean, pixel perfect, not something that looks like, that's very close to. We're talking pixel by pixel the same. So I think, yeah, it's an important area of research because it's also cyber safety, right? It's cybersecurity. If you can reproduce the training data, what else can you do to manipulate the models? So the people who create the models are quite concerned about this. You raise a very interesting point about the robots. Of course, they want to keep the model fresh, so they want new data. I don't know exactly what the architecture of how that will be used. The publishers have already actually, working through W3C, working through our standards bodies, have already made a standard for saying, please don't copy me for AI purposes. Yeah,
they basically only opt out.
Yeah, because the European law says you must have the ability to opt out for commercial purpose. Yeah, but the piracy problem combined with this,
Okay, thank you, Peter.